The forgotten campground. A group of college friends, seeking a break from their studies, decided to go camping in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains. The place they chose was off the beaten path, a spot known only to seasoned hikers and adventurers. It was perfect, quiet, isolated, and far from civilization. As they set up camp, they noticed an old, abandoned campground nearby. The area was overgrown with weeds, and the wooden sign that once welcomed visitors was rotting and barely legible. They shrugged it off, laughing about the potential ghost stories they could tell later. That night, as they sat around the fire, the wind started to pick up. The trees whispered in the breeze, and an unsettling feeling washed over them. One of the friends, Mark, suggested they explore the old campground. It was a bad idea, but fueled by the thrill of the unknown and a few drinks, they all agreed. As they approached the abandoned site, they noticed something strange. The old cabins, though decrepit and falling apart, seemed to have recently been used. There were footprints in the mud, and the fire pit looked as though it had been lit not too long ago. The air felt heavy, and the silence was deafening. Suddenly, they heard a rustling in the bushes. They froze, thinking it was just an animal, but then a figure emerged. A man, gaunt and wild-eyed, dressed in tattered clothes. He mumbled incoherently, staring at them with eyes that seemed devoid of any humanity. Terrified, they slowly backed away, but the man followed, his mumbling growing louder and more frantic. He began to shout, his voice echoing through the woods. Panicked, the group turned and ran back to their camp. But when they arrived, they found it completely destroyed. The tents slashed, their belongings scattered, and the fire extinguished. The man was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered in the air. They quickly packed what little they could salvage and made their way back to their car. But as they drove away, they realized something chilling. The man had left something behind in the car. A small, carved wooden figure, identical to one they had seen in the abandoned campground. They never spoke of that night again, but the figure remained, a haunting reminder of the terror they had encountered in the forgotten campground. The stalker in the woods. Claire had always loved the outdoors. Growing up in Oregon, she spent most of her free time hiking and exploring the vast forests that surrounded her hometown. It was her escape, a place where she felt at peace. But after what happened last summer, she could never set foot in those woods again. It started as a normal hike. Claire had planned to spend the weekend alone in the mountains, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. She had chosen a trail she knew well, one that led deep into the forest and eventually to a secluded lake. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, but as she hiked deeper into the woods, she began to feel uneasy. The forest, usually filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, was eerily silent. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to brush it off, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every step. Then, she noticed something that made her heart race. Footprints, not hers, fresh in the dirt, following the trail she had taken. Claire stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around, but saw no one. The footprints, however, told a different story. Someone was following her, keeping just out of sight. She quickened her pace, her mind racing with fear. As she neared the lake, she heard a twig snap behind her. She turned, but saw nothing. The silence was oppressive, the forest now an ominous labyrinth. Panic set in, and Claire broke into a run, her only thought to reach the safety of the lake and the small cabin she had rented. But when she arrived, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, the place was a mess, as if someone had ransacked it. Her belongings were strewn across the floor, and the window was shattered. In the middle of the chaos, she found a note, hastily scrawled, "I see you." Claire bolted from the cabin, running back the way she came. But the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting into menacing shapes. She could hear footsteps behind her, growing closer and closer, but every time she looked back, there was no one there. When she finally reached her car, she didn't stop to catch her breath. She jumped in, started the engine, and sped away, the sense of dread following her all the way home. Even now, the memory of those footsteps haunts her. The stalker in the woods was never found, but Claire knows he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next hiker to venture too deep into the forest. The unseen passenger. Tom had been driving trucks for over 20 years, and he had seen his fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing compared to what happened on that deserted highway one cold, rainy night. He was on a long haul transporting goods from New York to Chicago. The weather had been miserable all day, and the rain showed no sign of letting up. As the night grew darker, the highway became a desolate stretch of asphalt, with nothing but the occasional flash of lightning to break the monotony. Tom was used to driving alone, but that night he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It was as if someone or something was sitting in the passenger seat beside him. He glanced over several times, but of course, there was nothing there. Just the empty seat and the darkened road ahead. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger as the night wore on. Tom tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but his eyes kept drifting to the passenger seat, half expecting to see someone there. Then, as he passed a particularly dark stretch of road, he felt a cold breeze sweep through the cab, even though the windows were up and the heater was on full blast. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. Suddenly, the radio, which had been off, crackled to life. A voice, low and distorted, came through the static. "You shouldn't be out here," it whispered. "Turn back." Tom's heart raced. He fumbled with the radio, trying to turn it off, but the voice persisted, growing louder and more urgent. "Turn back now." Panicking, Tom slammed on the brakes, pulling the truck to the side of the road. The voice stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving him in eerie silence once again. Shaken, he took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. It had to be a malfunction, a trick of the mind, he told himself. But when he looked into the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, sitting in the back seat. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, staring directly at him. Tom didn't wait to see what would happen next. He floored the gas pedal, speeding down the highway, his eyes glued to the road. When he finally dared to look in the mirror again, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. He didn't stop until he reached a truck stop miles away, where he parked and locked the doors, too terrified to sleep. The next morning, he inspected the truck, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No one had been in the truck with him, but the experience left him questioning his own sanity. To this day, Tom avoids that stretch of highway, and he never drives at night. The memory of the unseen passenger haunts him, a reminder that some things on the road are more than just shadows in the night. The cursed object. Jenna had always loved antiquing. There was something about old, forgotten items that fascinated her. Their history, the stories they carried. So when she stumbled upon a quaint little shop in a small New England town, she couldn't resist stepping inside. The shop was filled with all sorts of curiosities, old furniture, vintage clothes, and strange, dusty trinkets. But one item in particular caught Jenna's eye. A small, intricately carved wooden box. It was beautiful, yet unsettling, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes, noticed Jenna's interest and smiled. "That's a special piece," she said. "But I must warn you, it comes with a history." Intrigued, Jenna asked about the box's origin. The shopkeeper hesitated, then explained that the box was believed to be cursed. It had been passed down through generations, bringing misfortune to anyone who owned it. Jenna, always skeptical of such stories, dismissed the warning as mere superstition and decided to buy the box. That night, Jenna placed the box on her nightstand, admiring its craftsmanship before drifting off to sleep. But her dreams were anything but peaceful. She found herself in a dark, twisted version of her own home, with the box at the center of it all. Shadows moved around her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. When she woke up, she was drenched in sweat, the box still on her nightstand, seemingly untouched. But the unsettling feeling from her dream lingered. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects in her house moved on their own, lights flickered, and she heard faint, disembodied voices at night. Jenna tried to ignore it, but the occurrences grew more frequent and more terrifying. One night, she woke up to find the box open, even though she had never touched it. Inside, she found a small piece of paper with a single word written on it: "Leave." Terrified, Jenna took the box back to the shop, but when she arrived, the shop was gone. In its place was an empty lot, as if the shop had never existed. Desperate, she tried to get rid of the box, but no matter what she did, whether she threw it away, burned it, or buried it, it always found its way back to her. The curse had taken hold, and there was no escaping it. Jenna's life became a nightmare, the box a constant presence, a reminder of the dark power she had unleashed. In the end, she could only do one thing: lock the box away and pray that it would stay hidden, its evil contained. But deep down, she knew the curse would never truly be broken, and it was only a matter of time before the box claimed its next victim.